But sometimes in my synagogue, I am asked to be the leader of the prayers. When does this happen? When their time is late and everybody wants to be certain to finish on time. And that is my specialty. My voice is not beautiful, but I finish on time. So, do not worry. Of course, not everything can be said within a limited period of time. And so I can offer that if anybody wants to learn more, you are welcome to write to me at, I have a number of email addresses, but the simplest is stampfer@gmail.com, and you can write and say, I have nothing to do, please send me your paper so I can do something with my time. I do want to thank very much the previous speaker. I have much to learn from her, and I cannot now reorganize my paper to fit your comments, but this is a very important study that you are doing. And now I will try to raise some of the main points that interest me. I did some work on migration from the Bohemia Moravian lands to Poland. And the information that I found convinced me that the Jews of Poland are basically descended from a small numbers of Jews who moved eastward from Bohemia and Moravia and the nearby lands in the 15th, 16th centuries. And the numbers were small, but in the Polish land, Polish-Lithuanian lands, the population grew very rapidly. And what interests me today is to try and consider the relationship between the economic conditions in Poland, Lithuania, and the patterns of Jewish migration. My assumption is a very obvious and not original one. People migrate when they think they will be able to have a profession or to make a living in another land. In other words, is there a niche, a space available for migrant Jews? In the case of Jews who migrate, but every population is the same. Now, one of the things that should be considered is the early Jewish population of the Eastern Europe. Before the Mongol invasions, there were Jewish communities apparently of Crimean or Byzantine origin in Eastern Europe. However, what is without a question clear that they did not grow into large communities. What exactly happened is not so clear. But if we consider the economic function of the Jews, they did not have a great economic function. The cities were very small at this time. The main occupation was in trade from east to west, and there were other populations who could trade just as well as the Jews did, and even better, such as what later we saw the Armenians. So the opportunities for population growth were very limited. And when you have small communities, it is not very difficult for a sudden change to lead to their end. The Jews who migrated from Bohemia, Moravia, this expanded region, did not have a similar fate. Their populations grew rapidly, which suggests that the niche or the place for them was quite different. So what happened? We can take a look at the 14th and 15th centuries and note that there was a significant migration of German speakers, what is called the Ostsiedlung, or Dutch, which is close to that, which settled in Eastern Europe. These populations were mainly farmers or peasants who worked the land. There was a need for populations with agricultural skills to settle. Jews did not have those skills. On the other hand, in Central and Western Europe, there was overpopulation. There was not enough land for the growing population of peasants. Moving to the east was a good solution. The Jewish migration was a bit later. It was not part of the same. What kind of a country were they moving into? The 14th and 15th centuries, early 16th century, 16th, even a bit later, was a period of growing production of grain in Polish-Lithuanian lands and export of grain through the northern ports, especially Danzig or Gdansk, to the west. This large-scale grain trade offered many economic opportunities, but then again, not for Jews. This trade was dominated by German, Dutch, to a degree, Scots were involved, some degree Italians. They dominated the export of grain, and the port cities were relatively close to Jews. So the Jews had no real room to go into the grain trade, and they also were not needed. The grain trade was very effectively run by the existing exporters. In the same way, the imports, which came very much from the south, from Italy, were taken care of by Italian traders, and again, Jews were not needed. The small numbers of Jewish migrants were not coming so much because they were needed for the economy in the East, but rather because of population pressure on the Jews, the difficulty in finding places to earn a living in Bohemia, Moravia. Some people found the solution for themselves moving eastward. But it was not a large migration, and it was not because they were needed. The population that came, some were involved in money lending. But this was very exceptional. It was not what everybody did. And indeed, money lending was not a growth profession in this period. Until around 1600, there was a shortage of silver in Europe. And because silver was short in supply, money lending was very profitable. However, with the Spanish conquest of South America, Europe was flooded with silver. Huge amounts came to Europe, and this led to a drop in the value of silver, and it became more worthwhile to borrow money than to lend money. It's the same way in inflation. When money is losing value quickly, that is the time to borrow. because what you return will be less than what you borrowed. That's the way inflation operates. And that's why the great money lenders of the 17th century and on were institutions like the churches who had money because they were given money and had to do something with it. The individuals who had money found other things to do other than to loan. So that few Jews went into money lending, although those that succeeded were well known, because it is easy to write an article in a journal when there are lots of sources, and money lenders give sources. Most of the Jews, however, were small-scale merchants, dealers in used clothes, people who loaned small amounts of money for pledges, who dealt in pawns. And Jews relatively quickly entered a new and growing profession which did create a niche, and that is administering taxes. As the population was growing, the general population, there was more production, more exports, then there were also more taxes. And people were needed to collect taxes and administer. This is a growing field. Who could be the potential tax collectors? Collecting taxes is not pleasant. Nobody brings flowers to the person who collects the money from income tax. Nobody says, thank you for taking 10% at the store. It's unpleasant, and much of these taxes are collected on site. In other words, in villages and small towns, the people who have to pay for using a mill, people who have to pay for crossing a bridge. These are all lonely occupations in which people who collect the taxes live a somewhat dangerous life, pressed by all sides. The great German merchants or the Dutch merchants were not eager to go live in a village and collect taxes. The real potential for competition, for entering this field, was from the lower nobility, the Schlachter. This was a population which did not have land. If they had land, they wouldn't be lower nobility, they would be the higher nobility. There were nobles with land, but there were many lower nobles who were in need of a profession. They also had the skills, the knowledge to collect taxes. However, this is an example already in the 15th, 16th, early 17th century of this common rule that what is good in one generation is not good in another. The nobility, the lower nobility, had the values of being a brave soldier because the nobility grew in a world where soldiers were needed. And collecting money, writing down things in a book all day, this was not what a true nobleman should do. And indeed, in the early legal statutes, it was written that a lower noble should not involve himself in trade or collecting taxes or money lending. This could lead to him even losing noble status. It was against the ethics. The Jews did not have any problems with collecting taxes. They were not enamored, they did not want to be brave soldiers, they just wanted to feed their children. So here was a growing area which offered opportunities to Jews for a occupation. When in the mid 17th century there was a drop in the export market, caused, among other reasons, by better agricultural technology in Western Europe, which freed that part of Europe from the need to import. The response of the noble rulers of lands was, if they cannot export, at least they can take more taxes from the peasants. This process of manorization, or second serfdom, was a very unpleasant process for the peasants, but it did increase the need for tax collectors, administrators, everybody involved in that area. And this was one in which Jews could enter, and they did. Once you have a network of Jews in many, many small towns, many of them running a tavern or having the monopoly on selling alcohol, this also creates economic networks. When one looks at Jewish rich Jews and exporters, what were they doing in the early modern period? They never exported very much by river to Gdansk and to the west. However, Jews were active in the overland export from Poland, Lithuania to Germany, very much by Leipzig, on the ground. Here it is interesting to note, what were Jews exporting? Among other items, they were exporting furs and honey. How does a person export honey? You need to fill up a wagon with honey. But you do not have large industrial producers of honey. How does this market work? You have many small collectors or producers. They sell their products at the local tavern. The Jewish tavern owners, who form an economic network, sell this on to Jewish wholesalers, and that way they collect enough to justify sending a wagon of honey to the west. The same is true of furs, and the same is true of the important export industry of cattle. In Hungary, there were huge cattle farms. If anybody has watched a movie about cowboys in America, 200 years later, you also had huge herds of cows. Coming from Poland, Lithuania, we have multiple small markets where people sell their cow to make a living. Somebody collects cows, and when they have enough, they send a herd to the west. So that this network of small businesses or small merchants, which was based on collecting taxes, also enabled economic activity in terms of export. So that if we want to look at the Jewish population of Eastern Europe in the 18th century, where it was remarkable in terms of the large numbers of rural Jews, and remarkable in terms of the huge population. In 1500, the number of Jews in Eastern Europe and Western Europe was about the same. In 1800, the population of Jews in Eastern Europe was a totally different order of magnitude larger than in Western Europe. So the conditions which allowed this population growth, the conditions which pushed so many Jews to live in rural areas and to enter the occupations that they did, was determined by the Polish and Lithuanian economic environment. Everybody would say this is not a surprise. Economics determines a great deal. However, seeing how this happens can be interesting. Thank you. I finish on time.
Thank you very much. But I think that
We do not have time for...
maybe 5 minutes, okay? So, okay, I ask, okay, so the first question is?
Well, may I? Two-part question.
Okay.
One is, I was intrigued by your claim that you sort of traced down the Polish Jewry population of the later centuries to the Bohemian Moravian source, so to speak, the root. How do you trace it back? By following names, genetic, DNA tracking, or what was the mechanism? What was the basis for that claim? And the second part of that question, of my question is, could it be that the explosion, as it were, population growth, Jewish population growth in Poland was due to that economic conditions, but which sort of stretched from east to west, like for instance Yarosław and Frankfurt in the end of 15th, 16th century was a very important route. Yarosław was, as you said rightly, a small town physically. It had about 2,000 at most, but at the time of the fair, something like 30,000 people descended. And there were huge herds of cattle being driven from the east to Germany, not so much from Hungary, but from the east. Would it be that, and as well, on that stretch, there were lots of little towns which were privately owned, like Yarosław, for instance. And could it be that the sort of growing private towns helped? Because I have a three-part question. Because you also corrected yourself, you said Lithuanian, bringing Lithuania, but was really Lithuania so closely economically linked that in the 15th, 16th century to the Polish, like, Ruskie voivodeship?
Well, those are good questions. First off, I wrote an article on the origins of the Jews, and anybody who wants it, if you write to me, I'll send you a digital copy. The evidence that we have is really names, because oddly enough, the names of Jews are very similar to Bohemian Moravian and very, very different from Rhineland. The religious customs in the prayer books are classic Bohemian Moravian, and you don't find any references to the German populations. Thirdly, at the times when you would expect the migrants to come from Germany, this was shortly after the Black Plague, and most of German Jewry had been killed, and that which survived didn't have to travel to Poland to earn a living. They could stay where they were because so many cities were empty. But there are many more reasons that I can offer. There's no genetic evidence because nobody yet has checked the genetics of Western Jews. And I've begged people to do it because there's an easy way. You can go to Alsace. Germany is a mess because Jews always came from the east to Germany. But Alsace-Lorraine, Strasbourg, Metz, that is old Ashkenazi population with very little migration. All that is necessary is to go to a house for old people, old Jews in Strasbourg, take blood from 50 people, and you have the article. I can't do it. I don't deal with the genetics, but nobody has done it, and I've begged people to do it. with regard to the population growth, of course, small private cities were very, very important because they offer Jews opportunities to settle in cities, and that helps population growth. But the help for population growth is from the side. Why are the new cities good? Because they're not so dirty and the water is not so polluted. People in cities usually died because of disease. More people died in cities than were born in the early modern period. Cities survived because of in-migration. They did not cause population growth, they caused population decline. It was only when cities got clean water and people did not take their drinking water from the toilets, there was only when there was clean water that the death rate dropped. But that was 19th century. The new cities had an advantage. There's much more to be said, but it's not fair when people have to eat. But if anybody is interested in more information, write to me. I'll be happy to send you what I have.
Thank you very much. We had 3 questions, so I think that we can close our session. Thank you very much for all speakers, and also I would like to thank Ilya Leński, who translates our discussion. Thanks.